Okay, so just to stay on time for our break, we are going to have our second pair now of Mid-Atlantic talks. So LeeAnn, if you can bring up your talk, I'm going to introduce LeeAnn Haaf, who is our awesome collaborator, along with Josh Moody, who you're going to hear from tomorrow, from the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. LeeAnn is the Wetlands Coordinator at PDE, where she oversees programs including the Mid-Atlantic Coastal Wetland Assessment and the synthesis of scientific data on estuarine processes that contribute to the health of the Delaware Estuary. She also conducts research on tidal wetland dynamics and coastal forests to better understand landscape level changes in response to sea level rise and climate change. Over to you, LeeAnn.
All right, thank you, Jordan. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The little, when you unclick mute, the little thing pops away, so I couldn't see if I actually hit it or not. Thank you. All right, so today I'm going to be going over some of the crosswalking work that we've done between existing tools for wetland assessment. So at first, I'll talk a little bit about PDE's tool for the wetland assessment tool for condition and health, or we like to call that WATCH. I'll also go over some of the EPA tools that we've used as complementaries to the WATCH tool, including the relative wetland vulnerability framework that Anna had just talked about, as well as the adaptation design tool. And then I'll go over some of the crosswalk terminology, attributes and metrics, and some of the steps between the two tools just as part of the crosswalk. So first, again, Josh is going to talk probably a little bit more about this, but I'm just going to give a brief overview of this WATCH tool because it's the first time that we're going to see it. So WATCH, like I said, stands for the Wetland Assessment Tool for Condition and Health. It was designed for assessing the condition of salt marshes, whose health and susceptibility to loss is dependent on a variety of different interacting factors. It's that variety of interacting factors, however, that make it difficult to know precisely what is wrong or how things are changing. So just like going to the doctor where they evaluate all the symptoms together before making a diagnosis, WATCH aims to apply a similar holistic approach to assess wetland health. So WATCH is a framework that organizes the data and it holistically evaluates up to 6 different attributes shown to be fundamental for salt marsh function. WATCH guides the user through choosing relevant metrics and appropriate methods, and it follows a hypothesis testing format where no deficiency is assumed and the outcomes are determined based on the weight of the evidence that the user provides to the tool. Right now, it's in a spreadsheet format where the user inputs information related to current conditions, reference conditions, and trajectory states for each of those attributes, and then WATCH actually performs the calculations and then does a brief integration of those. So this a little bit of a busy figure, but I think it summarizes WATCH really well. So at the top, we have our 6 attributes in that top pick box. So the user inputs data regarding current states, any acceptable ranges or boundaries, which we call criteria, any trajectory information, which are usually rates of change, and then a time frame of interest. So based on the weight of the evidence, the provided evidence, WATCH can let you know if you have or will exceed any of the criteria that you inputted for each of these attributes. And then if there's a unique combination of attribute violations that are indicative of impaired functionality, WATCH will provide an overall site status of deficiency detected, which is that output down in the gray box below. However, if there's not enough evidence to signal that there is a deficiency, but some of the attributes had been violated, WATCH will also let you know that those attributes were violated, and just so that you can keep an eye on those things. So again, Josh Moody will talk a little bit more about this and some of the other tools that we're developing tomorrow, so definitely stay tuned for that. So WATCH does have a lot going on for it, but there's of course other tools out there to do slightly different things. So how can we use these multiple tools in concert with one another to develop a fuller picture of vulnerability to pick the best tactics for intervention? So we like to sort of think of this as a 3-level process that starts first with level 1 or site prioritization. So for that, we sort of look to the relative wetland vulnerability framework that Anna discussed. Then next, moving down to level 2 or site-specific issues, we're looking towards WATCH. So trying to nail down a few spots and gather more specific intel about what's going on at the site. And then for level 3, really focused on picking issue-specific tactics And for that, we'll look at the adaptation design tool. So just briefly to go over the relative wetland vulnerability framework again, that Anna had already gone over, it does address some of those larger scale site selection issues that we come across. It does have a multiple step process that looks at classification. So basically trying to target certain populations or wetland types. It's going to define some attributes, trying to decide what we're going to measure and why. Splitting things further into principal factors. So basically trying to find what factors actually influence wetland dynamics, and then you can further bin that into exposure and response. Exposure being those external factors that are enacting on the wetlands, and then the responses of those wetlands to those external factors being the response category. And then the metrics actually refer to the specific quantitative data types that you're going to use to represent exposure or response. And then all of that gets wrapped up into that vulnerability profile that's actually used to help link some of the management tactics and support adaptation. And so Jordan had already gone over a little bit of this example from Dennis Creek, so I don't want to spend too much time. But in that example, we did use the relative wetland vulnerability framework to assess the exposure of salt marshes in Dennis Creek to sea level rise and track some of those changes in salt marsh acreage as the response, with the major goal being to help identify suitable management tactics for both now and into the future. So adding that extra layer with Watch, we could go further into prioritizing areas within the Dennis Creek watershed, which Jordan, I think, also shows sort of like a zoom in of one particular spot in Dennis Creek, where you can collect more specific information that's then fed directly into the Watch tool. And then by doing that at multiple different sites at the sub-watershed scale, you could possibly also compare those different within site factors using the Watch criteria, standards, and trajectories. So next, after we perform those sites, site level, level 1 assessments, site prioritization, and then level 2 using the Watch tool, we next might want to actually filter through some tactics using the adaptation design tool, so which I'll just abbreviate as the ADT. The ADT helps users apply that climate smart designs for management tactics and find those additional adaptation actions that might be needed. The ADT workflows help find information gaps, research needs, and find areas of synergy or conflict among specific actions. So here, this is a part of the ADT worksheet, which could possibly be used in conjunction with Watch outputs. So once vulnerabilities and deficiencies are identified on the ground using Watch, what are the possible next steps to consider before tactic selection? What are the key components of the system that need to be considered before interventions are deployed? And some of the design considerations can be split into two different categories. Category 1 being how will climate change directly or indirectly affect how the stressors of concern impact the system. And then to the right here, you can see part of the worksheet and some of the main categories that we're going to explore using that category 1 in that question. And then category 2, what are the implications for functionality of the management action and how will it need to be adjusted in terms of the location, timing, and structural design? And again, an example of the worksheet is to the right there. And so if we take these crosswalks into action, we'll see that these frameworks can work in unison. They represent different approaches, and they also fill gaps in the stepwise process of implementing the intervention tactics. So we did dig a little bit deeper into the crosswalk between the relative vulnerability framework and PDE Watch tool. And this is just a summary slide of that crosswalk with some more specific information about Watch to the left and more specific information about the relative wetland vulnerability framework on the right there. But in total, we saw that both tools were systematic and flexible for the user, which I think are really important parts of being able to implement a bunch of tools for different spatial areas. There were very few limitations on what types of data could be used in either framework, which is also pretty important. Watch, however, is a little bit more bottom up. So we're going to start with a specific site, collect on the ground data that is then synthesized to determine possible problems that could be addressed through intervention tactics. Whereas the relative wetland vulnerability framework is a little bit more top down. So it was designed to catalog those vulnerabilities at a larger spatial scale, answering questions like where is most vulnerable and what might be done to shift those trajectories. And in this table, just diving a little bit deeper on some of the crosswalking. So on the right here, you'll see that there's some terminology from the Relative Wetland and Vulnerability Framework, and then some more terminology that we have actually used for WATCH. So in most cases, we do see that the classification or the big picture problem is not necessarily the first step in WATCH. It assumes that you've already got an understanding of possible landscape issues, mostly geared towards salt marshes, and that you've probably already picked out your focal site. WATCH then moves to diagnose any problems, which could also be captured in the relative wetland vulnerability response variables. So there's synergy there. But WATCH itself doesn't actually get into cataloging any of the exposures that the wetland vulnerability framework does, or what is actually causing the problems. Therefore, the relative wetland vulnerability framework might help identify those broad watershed-wide exposures and responses that could be key consideration when selecting sites, especially if you're selecting sites for WATCH. And then once those areas are chosen, WATCH then continues on with the process in quantifying precisely how those exposures and responses have created current conditions at a specific site, and then sets the user up for next steps like designing specific restoration targets or intervention targets, or even crafting monitoring plans. So again, in this table, we sort of see that the principal factors in the relative wetland vulnerability framework match with some of the attributes in WATCH, which is that third row there. So once the principal factors are identified through the relative wetland vulnerability framework, you can actually feed those data metrics directly into the WATCH tool by collecting that information on the ground. So I know I'm a very quick talker, but here's the conclusion slide. So hopefully we can address any questions a little bit later or have more active discussion on things. But just in summary, assessing and diagnosing the issues and the various stressors and interactions are essential first steps in a lot of restoration and intervention planning and design, but they're really not always easy to organize. So in this talk, we've gone over 3 tools that support evaluation and planning for today and tomorrow in systematic but flexible ways. These tools can be part of a complementary process that works stepwise to get an overview of the landscape level, exposures and responses, like we talked about level 1 with the relative vulnerability framework. Level 2 with site-specific condition assessments that we could deploy using the WATCH tool, and then how to incorporate climate smart design in tactic selection, which we saw through the adaptation design tool. And to use any of these tools, it might not actually be necessary to dive very deeply into all 3. Understanding the philosophies and the key concepts behind each might actually be all that's necessary to address some of the critical needs, data needs that you need for vulnerability determination. So lastly, and picking the best tools is really hard. There's so many different tools out there. So moving forward, we found that contextualizing how the various tools that we were familiar with align or complement each other with and how specific goal, one specific goal could be reached using multiple tools was an important step in making these tools overall accessible for some managers. And that's all I have. So I'm going to try to stop sharing.
Thanks, LeeAnn. That was awesome. Thank you.